Hello everyone, this is Professor DePaulo welcoming you back to Psych 265 Online. And in today's lesson, we'll be talking about qualitative research. So as researchers, we have multiple options. We have to weigh our options. Which type of design is going to be better for us as a researcher? Well, one way you can go is through the use of a qualitative research design. And with the qualitative research design, this is a group of methodologies that focus on obtaining in-depth understanding of our participants' perspectives and their experiences. So you're getting a lot of descriptive information and you're not getting the numerical information that you get with, like, say, a survey. You're getting mainly descriptive information and using that descriptive information to tell a story and then sometimes to test a hypothesis, although it's a little bit difficult because you can't do statistics or traditional data analysis on this type of research. So you're gaining lots of in-depth information on a few individuals with the hope of understanding their experiences. And you get much more information than you do with a large-scale survey or that you do in a sit-down and experiment on a computer. You're actually getting to know the person. You're sitting down for probably an hour at a time to talk about their lives. This is very popular within the clinical realm or clinical domain. With quantitative research, you're looking for associations. You're looking for numerical associations like a correlation or differences between groups like with a t-test or an ANOVA. And you're able to test a hypothesis much more directly and much more conclusively than you can with qualitative research. So quantitative research is kind of like a yes or no answer. Is my idea working? If you reject the null hypothesis, yes. If you don't reject the null hypothesis, then no, your idea is not working. Whereas qualitative research is a matter of degree, it's a matter of telling a story. It's not a yes or no answer to your question. The research uses less, quantitative research that is, uses less detailed information collected from more people. So if you want to collect data quickly, but you don't need an in-depth analysis of the person. So that means you don't need an hour's worth of data in the form of an interview or something else. Then quantitative research is good for you. If you just want a lot of data and it's easy to collect and it doesn't cost that much money, I would definitely go with quantitative research. And this is the domain of research that I use personally, and I don't do any qualitative work just because I like looking at data. And I feel like data is a stronger indication of something happening. Now, I have great respect for people that use qualitative research. It's just that for my personality, it doesn't really blend with what I'm interested in doing. Researchers use in the quantitative field use statistics and numbers to summarize large groups of data. And then they extrapolate that information to hopefully the entire population you're studying. It's a little harder to do that with qualitative research. We can also do mixed methods, which is a mix of both qualitative and quantitative methods. And this is a very good approach because you're tackling the problem from multiple angles, and whatever conclusions you're going to draw pretty solid ones because you got both the descriptive information that supports your idea, the qualitative research, and you got the numerical information that supports your idea, which is the quantitative research. So qualitative and quantitative are not completely dichotomous or distinct. They can go together, and I've actually run some studies with qualitative aspects that were mostly quantitative, and those qualitative aspects boost the story you can tell with the numbers. Now, taking a look at the differences between qualitative and quantitative, for qualitative, you have a focus on obtaining in-depth information from fewer participants. So you study a few people, but you get a lot of information from those few people. You also value each person's perspective. You learn insight into their own experience, which you can't get with a survey. You also can study participants in naturally occurring settings. So you don't bring them into a laboratory necessarily where they may act differently. You study them in the real world, and that's kind of where we want to draw our conclusions. We want our conclusions to apply to the real world. Qualitative research also favors description over reliance on numbers. So once again, some people are not comfortable with numbers, or they think numbers are not an accurate description of behavior. And so if that's the case, qualitative research is something that you probably would like. There's very little hypothesis testing. It's more about just gathering information. It definitely does not see cause and effect because you're studying small samples and you're not really controlling anything. You're not directly manipulating the independent variable in any way. And it doesn't seek to generalize to broader populations. Whereas quantitative research looks at specific pieces of information. So you can gather a lot of information, very specific information from a large group of people, and you can do it relatively quickly and cheaply. Whereas qualitative research, you have to spend money hiring people to do interviews because you can't do them all as a researcher yourself, and you wouldn't want to do all the interviews as a researcher yourself because you might be biased when interacting with a participant. So it's much more costly to do qualitative research. Quantitative research doesn't place much emphasis on participants' subjective interpretation. It just basically answer the question and we move on to something else. There's not really a drill down on sort of how they feel about each particular question. You could do quantitative research more favorably in the laboratory versus the real world. You use numbers to describe their thoughts and behaviors. There's an emphasis on hypothesis testing, so you get an answer yes or no, or maybe. You don't get that necessarily with qualitative. You seek cause and effect conclusions. So if you run a true experiment with random assignment, you can develop cause and effect conclusions for each hypothesis you test, and you can generalize the study's findings to broader populations. So you can apply the findings to the population at large, which is also known as external validity. Qualitative research, I should say, provides very little guidance or structure to the study. So the researcher has a lot more influence on how the study goes when you're doing a qualitative research. Qualitative research also avoids summating, categorizing, or reducing the data in any way during data collection. And of course, the researcher has a big influence on what the project turns out as. So qualitative research is much more flexible than quantitative research because you have more control over what you're looking at and what data you're gathering. And you actually have more control over what conclusions you draw since there isn't numbers and you're not directly testing hypotheses most of the time. In quantitative research, it's much more structured. So the researcher is defined rather than participant defined. So the researcher asks the questions, the participants respond relatively briefly, generally through the use of a number, a rating scale, like what's considered a Likert scale. For example, a scale of 1 to 7, how much do you like BMCC? That's a Likert scale, and it's just a number. And that's what you would get in a quantitative study, whereas in a qualitative study, you would sit down and talk to someone about your experiences at BMCC and why you like or dislike those experiences. So you're getting much less information in a quantitative study, but you're getting very specific details. So if you're details driven like I am structured driven and details driven, that kind of brings me to quantitative research. Quantitative research also gives you more solid conclusions because it's based off of statistical tests rather than different responses per individual, what you get with qualitative research. And the quantitative research completely eliminates most of the influence the researcher has on the study. Whereas in qualitative research, you're really deciding what to collect and how to collect it, so you're having a much more hands-on role in the study. With quantitative, you don't. If you send out surveys, you can even post them online. You have no interaction at all with any of the participants. So that can be a benefit in some ways. So how do we evaluate qualitative methodology? Well, the benefits include reflexivity. So the researcher can monitor his or her role in the data collection. So you could be aware of the influence you're having as a researcher on what data you're collecting. Whereas in a quantitative study, you don't have that because you're not getting any descriptive based answers. You're just getting numbers back. And numbers can't convey the whole gamut of feelings towards the research. Difficulties, though, for the qualitative approach involve lying or misremembering. While this is the same thing with quantitative with surveys, people lie or misremember as well. But the sort of consequences of lying or misremembering in a qualitative study is tremendous because you're not just gathering a couple questions on a survey. You may have hours worth of detailed information from your participant, which can be erroneous. So maybe they aren't lying to you. Maybe they just forgot exactly what they're telling you, and you're writing down all this information, you're recording all this data, and all that data is garbage because it's not true. It's not they purposely lied, they just didn't remember correctly. Or sometimes they just purposely lie. So people will purposely lie throughout an entire interview. That could be an hour, 2 hours long. If they don't feel like talking about their life, or they feel like they have to sort of embellish their life, they'll lie about it. And so you may not get accurate information in these cases, whereas with a quantitative approach, a survey approach, people may lie on certain questions, but you're only getting little snippets of information, so you're only getting small amounts of lies versus an entire study full of lies that you could get with a qualitative study. And qualitative studies generally use small samples, which are hard to generalize to the population at large. And you should also try with a qualitative study to engage in triangulation, which is involving multiple techniques. So you come up with multiple ways, not just an interview, but maybe an interview and a narrative, like a written piece, a narrative about something. And you analyze the writing, and then you analyze the interview, and you combine them together to come up with, a better conclusion, a more, I guess, a more well-backed conclusion since you have multiple sources of information. So that's the idea of triangulation, is to combine different sources of information to try, or different processes to get at the information you're looking to get at. This also allows researchers to be confident in their findings because they're getting similar answers through the different methodologies employed. So they're getting similar answers with a narrative analysis or writing analysis than they would be with just a strict interview. So that means that, look, these people are pretty consistent, so it's probably not lying about a particular situation. They're getting the same answer in both different modalities. So how do we decide what to do in terms of qualitative or the quantitative approach? Well, there's a couple ways we can look at this. The bottom-up approach is also known as the inductive approach or inductive reasoning. And this is an approach where the researcher explores a topic using information provided from participants' direct experiences. So this is a qualitative approach. You were interviewing or you're accessing information from the participant about their direct experiences and their emotions, etc. And you're using that information over one or several participants to then develop a theory. So it's bottom. So you're working up from the information, the data, and using that data to shape a theory that you will shape at the end of the process. So the information provided from the participants' direct experiences guides the researcher's development of the theory. So it's bottom up. And this is purely qualitative. And then you have a top-down approach, which is also called deductive or deductive reasoning, where you start with a hypothesis, and based on the hypothesis, you gather data to test that hypothesis. So for the most part, a lot of qualitative research is inductive, and a lot of quantitative research is deductive. Now, that's not everything, but if you want to come up with a general explanation, qualitative is mostly inductive, and quantitative is mostly deductive. And this is what it looks like. Here's our top-down approach, which is deductive. So you have a theory, you generate a hypothesis, you gather the data, and then you confirm or reject your original hypothesis. So this is the type of research that I personally engage in. I have an idea, I gather data, I test that idea, and I either reject the null, which basically means that I support my idea, by rejecting the null, or I fail to reject the null, which means I fail to support my idea. And hopefully I support my idea, but if I don't, then I can change my hypothesis or alter the theory and then generate an alternative hypothesis and then go through the process of collecting data again and then testing again. And so that's the top-down or deductive approach. The bottom-up or inductive approach is when I gather information, I look for themes or patterns in that information, and at the end, based on all the information gathered, I formulate a theory. So quantitative is mostly the approach done with on the left, the top-down approach, deductive, and qualitative often follows the inductive approach, which is shown on the right here. So if we're looking more at qualitative approaches, we can take a different stance or a different idea with regard to our qualitative approaches. And one way we can explore qualitative analysis is through something called situated analysis, where the researcher examines a topic while it's embedded in its naturally occurring context. So this is basically you're examining behavior in a natural setting. So whether this is through direct observation, probably not as much, or through record keeping, or journaling, or text analysis, these would all be examining behavior within a naturally occurring context. Holistic analysis is when you examine how numerous properties contribute to patterns within the larger and more complex system. So here you're trying to fit certain elements of behavior that you're analyzing into the whole, into the big picture, and see how they fit together. And there are many factors that contribute to a particular outcome. A holistic analysis will try to integrate all those different factors. So it's like, you're doing these small pieces, these small studies, and then you're putting these small studies together and forming a more comprehensive theory of behavior. And this can be useful because sometimes you can't study the entire behavior in its natural context. You can only study different elements of behavior at a given time. And so you can study these different elements and then kind of group them together once you have information about how these different elements of behavior emerge or they work together. So data collection can occur qualitatively through the phenomenological approach. And these are a variety of different techniques used within this umbrella. So you have action research, where a research design has participants trying to change some aspect of the researcher's focus. You have case studies, which are in-depth looks at single individuals. You have a content analysis, which is an analysis of usually something that is written, a written record. You have conversation analysis, which is basically analysis of dialogue, so recorded interviews, and behaviors associated with those recorded interviews, including sort of body language, nonverbal cues. You also have ethnography, where people study observations within a proper cultural context. So in their natural habitat where the behavior occurs. And this is good for looking at cultural influences on behavior. Focus groups are just, small groups of individuals. They're generally strangers that are put together to discuss a topic, and you get a variety of perspectives rather than with the case study, we're only focusing on one person. Rounded technique is when the researcher has no theories or hypotheses, but utilizes the inductive approach to generate information and build a theory. The interview is the sit-down conversation where the researcher asks questions and gathers self-report data from the participant. A narrative analysis is the examination of a first-person or autobiographical description of one's life, and the researcher looks at this from the storyteller's point of view. So based on sort of an autobiographical detail, uh, you can analyze aspects of the person's writing about their life and study behavior this way. The phenomenological approach looks at human experiencing and the meaning of experience based on how those involved view that situation. So it's basically the person that's involved in a particular outcome and how they feel about it, and also other people around that person. So, you can do this something like death in the family. A phenomenological approach would be looking at the person around those people that are the relatives or direct friends around that person that died, and sort of how they experience the situation. Then you tell a story through those people. Postmodern approach asks explicit questions about assumptions and the nature and capabilities of research. So this is kind of where you're abandoning kind of the research doctrine, and you're utilizing sort of a more in-depth approach to study the person. So you're not concerned with hypotheses and generating data. You're really only concerned with that particular person's experience in the moment. And visual ethnography is a type of ethnographic study that combines observations and interactions with visual media. So it's sort of an in-depth study of someone and their culture through observation and their natural habitat, but this also involves photographs and videos being used to sort of piece together the story. We can also look at archival data, which is data that's been stored somewhere, so data from the past. And this can include newspapers, health records, public records, internet sources, and we can use those data to tell a story. That's part of research. It's not really thought of as part of research within most of the psychological community, but some people will actually look at archival data. Some people will use data sets from the census. They'll use data sets from a national social survey to gather information on past behavior. And they won't collect any new data, so they're using pre-existing data. And one type of that is archival data. Obviously, the case study we talked about, an in-depth look of one individual, which is very important for studying rare events, rare diseases, things we don't know much about. And obviously focus groups, which are several participants put together and they discuss a topic. And they generally get paid, and it's usually a whole day thing. Very useful for marketing research. And focus groups have the benefit of providing how group members interact and resolve conflict. So if you're engaging a certain idea, you're doing research on a new brand or a new television show, etc., you can see how people interact, not just feel about it themselves, but how they interact with each other and how that influences behavior in the room. So you get a lot of debate going on in the focus group. It's much more in depth than just studying one person in the case study, because now you're dealing with how people really view the world, and they view the world as part of a group, not as a single individual isolated from the rest of society. This is also used in political research, and you'll see this often after an election or after a primary, where the news agencies will talk to people about what decision they made, who did they vote for, and why they voted for them. And this is very important information for each campaign to then utilize for the future, and know what people are thinking, and sort of how they come to a decision of who to vote for. Here are the type of case studies. You have the general case study, which of course is a study of one person over a period of time. You can have multiple case studies. You can have a case study that's more descriptive, so it looks for a well-explained, a lot of detailed information portraying the person's life, or if you have an intervention, how the intervention influences the person's life. So that's kind of like what happened in the person's life, the descriptive case study. The explanatory case study is why it worked. So it's not just what happened to the person, it's why things happened. Especially if you utilize an intervention, why did the intervention work or why did the intervention not work? The exploratory case study looks at the outline of potential outcomes of intervention. So if we do this intervention, what are the possibilities in this person's life? What could possibly happen to this person? Instrumental case study is a study designed to serve a specific purpose, such as theory building or as an example of a particular issue. An intrinsic case study is a case study where the researcher has a direct interest within a particular case. So you have a lot of different labels you can apply to case study, but just remember that case study generally is one person. And because it's only one person, it's really good at looking at rare events or rare behavior, rare diseases, but not so good at looking at the general consensus or drawing conclusions to the general population, because it's only one person. So it's hard to draw conclusions from one person to many, many thousands of people, if not millions of people. So let's move on from case study to interview, which is a very familiar technique which initiates a conversation between the researcher and the prospective participant, and it's a collection of self-report data. So the type of data you're getting is similar to what you're getting in a survey, except that you're getting a lot more of this information. So in the survey, you're getting very brief answers or numbers. Here you're getting like maybe hours and hours of information, of detail. And how you translate that detail, that information, and analyze it is up to the researcher. And the same problems that hold to self-report biases within surveys also hold with interviews, in that the person may not be honest with you. This is called social desirability. And the second point is the person may not remember. And that's not their fault. It's just that if you ask them, what was the experience of your childhood like, and their childhood was 30, 40, 50 years ago, 60, 70, 80 years ago, they're probably not going to remember much about it, or what they remember may not be accurate. Maybe they remember bits and pieces, but you're getting a lot of extraneous information that may not be relevant. So that's the only issue with the interview technique. The advantage of interviews is it allows the interviewer to build a relationship with the participant. And so the closer the participant feels with the interviewer, the more likely they're going to talk about a given situation. So the quality of the data will go up when the person feels rapport or a connection with the interviewer. And of course, you have full control over the wording and the sequence of questions asked. So you can ask whatever follow-ups you want, follow-up questions, or not ask them. It's really up to you. You have total control over how the interview goes. And the disadvantage, of course, is it can be artificial, it can be contrived. The person may tell you things to make themselves look good, which is social desirability. The person may lie blatantly for the sake of lying. The person may not remember everything. So is it the same thing as observing behavior in its natural setting? No, it's not. Is the information better than what you get on a survey? Possibly. I'm not sure though. Also the longer the interview, the more tired the participant becomes, and they're not going to want to talk too much about it. They may want to just try to get through the interview. So you want to keep the interview as short as you can to not fatigue the participant. There's debates over what's better, an interview versus a survey. And they both have advantages and they both have disadvantages. There's nothing that's better, not one's better than the other. I prefer the survey, just because I do survey-based research and do quantitative research, but I don't think there's a real systematic reason for why I like to do surveys versus interviews. I just feel more comfortable doing them. There are plenty of people that like to do interviews, and they feel very comfortable interviewing people, and they have a lot of skills to interview people. So there are advantages and disadvantages of every technique, and interview is just one of them. So the different types of interviews include structured interviews, where there is a series of questions in a fixed order, which is generally given. So with a structured interview, you have X number of questions. They have to be asked in a certain order, and there's no follow-up questions allowed because you have to follow a script. You're told to follow the script question by question, and you cannot deviate from that script. So this is used in terms of clinical practice to make a diagnosis. A structured interview is part of the DSM diagnosis process that you can choose to use a structured interview. It doesn't mean it's better or worse. It just, you're guaranteed to ask the right questions. If they're in a booklet and you're reading off the booklet, you're guaranteed to ask the right questions in the right order. All you have to do is read the questions and note the responses. And then you have unstructured interviews where the researcher asks whatever questions they want in any particular order, in any way they want. And this gives the researcher lots of maneuverability, lots of freedom, and you give them the benefit of the doubt to ask the appropriate question. And this is the type of interview that most people want to do as researchers. They don't want to do structured interviews unless they're basically told to. So usually, unless they're undergraduate students working on a project and they don't really have much experience doing interviewing. So then giving them a structured interview would be helpful. But an unstructured interview, if you have experience, is probably the way you want to go because it gives you the ability to go in different directions. And then you have the semi-structured interview, which is part of its ordered questions and part of its open format. And this can be useful if the ordered questions or the structured questions are necessary to be asked that way. I would prefer an unstructured interview, but if you're having research assistants who have never given interviews before, you probably want to give them a structured interview because they're not going to know the appropriate questions to ask because they don't have any experience. But once you have experience, the unstructured interview is the methodology that people want to choose. And you also have critical incident technique where people give descriptions of certain very important moments in their lives that they feel had major impacts on their lives, or particular trauma, talk about the trauma. That's another type of interview. So you're having the person focus on key aspects of their lives, traumas, celebrations, things that they can easily remember and that may have had more of an impact on their life. So conducting the interview, state the purpose of the interview to the participant, identify the appropriate participants, determine the questions to ask. And if you're doing unstructured, determine the follow-up question. So if you're given a certain answer, you need to follow up with another answer to probe that information more. And that allows you to determine the question order as well. If you're determining a structured interview, then you have to really plan this out in advance, know exactly what questions you want to ask, and make sure the order is correct because you're going to have everybody interview in the same order of questions. So it's a little more preparation to come up with a structured interview. You got to make sure that the questions are asked in the appropriate order to get the information you're looking for. But the advantage of the structured interview is that you don't have any variability in sort of what people are asking. Everybody's getting the same questions at the same points of time. There's no deviation. It's completely standardized. And we want to learn, depending on what kind of research we're doing, we may be studying one individual, so the interviews are geared towards one individual. If you're doing a focus group, obviously the questions of the interview will change because they're addressing the group. or if you're studying a given phenomenon, you need to relate the questions to that given phenomenon. And then the role of the interviewer, you got to be careful of interview bias. So if you know what you're looking for, if you have a certain idea that you're trying to test, a hypothesis, and you do the interviews, you may influence a participant's responses to support your ideas, your hypothesis. These are called leading questions. You ask questions in such a way to get a predetermined answer that then supports your hypothesis. And this is why if you're involved in qualitative research involving interviewing, you're best to train a student of yours to ask the questions. Because as an interviewer, you know too much about the study, and that may come out in the interview itself and bias your participants' responses to support your idea. So having students or other faculty or other grad students, etc., do the interviews helps avoid this bias. Qualities of a good interviewer: make sure you are fully knowledgeable about your participant, the interviewee, especially if that person is well known. You want to know exactly what their involvement in the field is. But even if you don't know them, even if they're general people off the street interviews, you want to show respect to the person. You want to have positive interaction with this person. This is very important. You should practice, because interviewing takes time to get good at. You're probably going to talk way too quickly at the beginning, or you're going to kind of mumble out the questions because you're nervous. If you first start interviewing, you're kind of nervous because you're in this position where you're asking strangers these questions. Some of the questions can be, a bit controversial or a bit, emotional at times, depending on what kind of research you're doing. Like if you're doing research on trauma, it can be disturbing to ask a question to a participant. So you need to practice. You need to get comfortable with people, and that's the only way you're going to get better. And of course, stay attentive, stay focused, show sensitivity and tolerance, show empathy for a person's struggles or misfortune. Develop what is called a rapport, a connection with the person. Same thing happens if you're a clinician, a psychologist, or a social worker, and you're working with a client. You need to show empathy, compassion, sensitivity, and tolerance. And then obviously you have to conduct the interview, so creating a schedule and an agenda, which is called a protocol. So these are the questions I'm asking. This is the order. This is, you can ask follow-up questions, so it doesn't have to be fully structured, but you got to have some questions that you want to ask. Like, these are the 10 most important questions I want to ask this participant. And then whatever are the questions I can ask that are relevant, I can throw them in there. If I'm doing an unstructured interview, I can ask what I want. But you generally want to have a list of something, because you can't remember every single important question that you want to ask. If you have a list to refer to, it's going to get you the necessary information without forgetting about it. So determining what questions to ask, obviously what's relevant, and the order for those questions, and when to ask a follow-up question. These are all important factors to becoming an effective interviewer. Something that takes years and years and years of experience to get towards. In the structured interview, of course, you have more format, more structure, so you don't have to make any decisions. If you're doing unstructured, then you have to really know, when should I probe, when should I follow up, and when should I pull back to not upset the person that I'm interviewing. Some other techniques in a qualitative analysis: we have grounded theory technique, where you don't start with a theory, you just gather information through interviews, through narrative analysis, etc., and then you build a theory. So this is the purely inductive approach. It's called the grounded theory technique. Conversation analysis, we had mentioned that previously, analyzing the transcript of a conversation. And interesting thing about conversation analysis is You can also do an analysis through the computer to look for certain emotional themes within a conversation. So you have a thematic analysis going on at times. You also look at nonverbal cues like turn taking, gaze direction. How do they, how are they communicating or engaging? Is the level of the dialogue the same throughout, or do they raise their voice or lower their voice? Do they look away from you? These are all important nonverbal cues that can indicate, emotion, anxiety, maybe reluctance to answer questions honestly. So that's very important to at least take a look at. And to do this, the researcher codes the data and then looks at the relationship between certain dialogue and certain themes. And the researcher then tells a story about it. And then obviously the content analysis goes through the computer, looking at certain words and determining what those words mean. And those are very common uh, methods for doing qualitative research. Is look at look at the conversation, the tone of the conversation, the behavior around the conversation, and also look at the content of the conversation and look for themes. And once you do that, you can then even quantify it if you want. You can have the computer turn those themes that you're looking for into numbers, and then you can look at the numbers and analyze it like you're doing a quantitative study. But most qualitative people don't need numbers in their research. They just need um, evidence to justify their beliefs. So that's it for today's lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you shortly.